Do you ever struggle with your faith in any way? Do you ever have things that you used to believe that you don't really believe anymore, or not so sure are true anymore? Or maybe you're kind of discovering and learning new things, and you're struggling to fit that into what you've historically believed. And as we go through our journey with God, that, again, whether you're new to faith or you've been in faith a long time, as we learn new things, just fitting all that together can be a struggle at times. And there are so many people telling you what you should believe and what you shouldn't believe, and this person's got the absolute answer. No, that person has the absolute answer, and they say opposite things, and how does that all work? But also the idea of struggling with our faith is much more about than just what we believe. Right, that we also meant to put our faith into action, to do things. And so as we think about faith being something that is active and alive, do we struggle to apply our faith? Are we able to love other people the way Jesus says that we're supposed to love other people? Are we generous in the way that Jesus says that we should be generous? Do we spend time engaging with God in His Word and praying and seeking His leading? Do we make those things regular parts of our lives? Now, this was not a list designed to make you feel bad about yourself, right? The reality is that all of us appear somewhere on that list, right? Because we all struggle with our faith at times, right? None of us have got this nailed. We never get it all figured out, right? It's a journey, right? Faith is a journey. And that's kind of the real point, right? Is that we're all going through that process. And there's this temptation to feel like faith is this kind of all in or all out thing. And it's just not reality. Right? That we're all working through it. We're all trying to figure out what we should do. And there are times we feel really close to God. And there are other times we feel really, really far from God, and He didn't move, sort of thing. Right? And so we're all working that out. And that's okay. In fact, I think one of the most helpful things that we can come to realize is that we're always growing in our faith, or at least always have that chance to grow in our faith, and that it is a journey that kind of carries on. And this idea of growing in our faith and feeling near and feeling far is not a new thing. If you read the New Testament, what we see over and over again are people struggling in their faith, growing in their faith. If we look at the Gospels are loaded with people who get it really, really wrong. But those very same people are often the ones who become kind of the most powerful followers of Jesus, people who do the most good. It seems to be that it's often in that struggle when we start to understand more deeply, we start to see what's really going on or what God's trying to show us. So what I wanted to do today was kick off a new series that I've called, It's Okay to Be a Work in Progress. You're like if you hear nothing else, just take that with you, right? It's okay to be a work in progress. There's one of my favorite 12-step aphorisms. I love that word, aphorisms. A principle stated simply and memorably, right? That's an aphorism. Progress, not perfection. That's what we're on. That's the journey we're on. Progress, not perfection. If we're making progress, we're heading in the right direction. And so what I wanted to do throughout this series was take a look at a number of the faith journeys that we find in the New Testament. And look at how people can kind of get it really wrong, it seems like sometimes, but then really turn it around. Or just the fact that people struggle to understand. And to recognize that even those people who were closest to Jesus, those initial followers, his apostles, the ones that we consider the great ones, how much they struggled to figure it out. And how much they got wrong at first. And then recognizing too that this idea that our journey of faith isn't even necessarily being just right and wrong, but it's often an idea of we understand things at one level at first, but then we understand at a deeper level as time goes on, and a deeper level as time goes on. That's really the journey of faith, is that there's this incredible just depth to the Word of God and the understanding of God and our relationship with God that oftentimes we just kind of scratch the surface, and that's a great place to be. But as we continue to engage with it, we start to see more deeply, and we start to understand more completely. And that's what we'll see this morning as we talk about what some of the apostles addressed and what they went through. Because I often think about, like, if we could go back and talk to those very first Jesus followers, and we said, like, when did you first understand who Jesus is? Like, when did you really finally get it? And could you tell us about your journey? And how is it that you caused so many other people to come to know Jesus? I think the thing they would tell us pretty quickly, slow down. That it takes time. That even in his presence, they needed time to understand. In fact, as we'll see this morning, that so much of what it seemed like they understood right away, they wouldn't actually understand for years later. And and one of the questions that often comes to mind for me is that the first century Jesus followers were up against incredible opposition, right? That they were opposed by the Roman government, they were opposed by the established religion, and as I've told you before, that they were looked at as a cult, as this kind of offshoot of a Judaism that was a cult. Yet somehow there are now 2 billion Christians. And the first 300 or so years of Christianity was up against incredible opposition. It was often executed for having that belief. And so you look at all that and go, well, how did you guys do it? Like, how did you get that going? And I think what's so amazing is, and this is hard for us to recognize in the time that we live in, where there is so much stuff layered on top of the fundamental message of Jesus. And instead, they didn't get tied up in that. They weren't worried about ecclesiastical structure. They focused on a very simple message, that through faith in Jesus and through his life, death, and resurrection, that real life transformation was possible. And that simple message shared in a personal way. People who were experiencing that in their lives shared it with other people that they knew. And those people would come to believe. Some would, some wouldn't. But enough did, and that process continued, that within a few hundred years, there were many, many Christians, till today when literally 1/4 of the world population is Christian. And this idea of, if we could ask them what we should do, like how do I know I'm on the right path with God, and how do I make sure I'm getting it all right? I think one of the things that they would say to us is that it's important that we don't get overly focused on our own expectations of what God is doing. That we often seem to think that God does the same thing the same way all the time. But you're an individual. I'm an individual. And our relationship with God is personal. And so it may be that we experience things in a different way. And we get to where we're going in a different way. And maybe the path for each of us is a bit different. Because I really believe, and I believe the apostles would back me up. I can't call them up and verify that. But I really believe that if we get too focused on the way we think God's going to do something, sometimes even getting too focused on what we think God's going to do, we set ourselves up to actually miss what he's really doing. Right? Because you can't put God in the box. Right? God's the one in charge. It's our role to seek him and follow him and see what he shows us. And if you look at the first 12 apostles, their path to coming to know Jesus was not the same for even that initial 12. Right? There were some who started to follow him pretty quickly. We think that Andrew, Philip, and we think John kind of started following him pretty directly. Didn't necessarily know that he was the Messiah yet, but that he was someone special. But then others were invited by people. In fact, Peter got to know Jesus because his brother Andrew invited him to come. And one of the lesser known apostles, Nathanael, same sort of thing. His friend Philip invited him to come. And one of the things I really find interesting in Nathanael's journey is that Nathanael started out like really cynical. Like he really wasn't buying it at first. But then goes through this incredible transformation. Because what happens is that we know that as first century Jews, they were looking forward to the arrival of the Messiah. That they would talk about the fact that the one that Moses had promised was here. And so they were looking for that. And so basically, Philip goes to Nathanael one day, after Philip has already met Jesus, And he says, hey, Nathanael, I think we might have found the Messiah. It's this guy, Jesus of Nazareth. And Nathanael's response is, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? Right? Like, he's prejudiced, right? He's not a racist, right? But he's actually prejudiced in the sense that that area of town, oh, nothing good comes out of there. You're telling me that the one promised by Moses is coming out of that place? And it's interesting. Like, Philip could have responded in a couple of different ways, right? He could have started arguing. No, man, you got to see it. This is how it is. What's wrong with you? He doesn't do that. He could have done a 10-point plan, breaking down the apologetics of all this. He doesn't do that either. What he says is, I've experienced it. It's changing me. I'd just like to invite you to come and check it out yourself. And because Nathanael trusts Philip, he agrees to go check it out. And so what ends up happening is Nathanael and Philip go to see Jesus. Jesus actually spots them off at a distance. And Jesus greets Nathanael, and he actually says, hey, Nathanael, this is Nathanael. He's a good and honest man. Now, this was very unexpected to Nathanael because he never met Jesus. And Nathanael didn't have, an Instagram page out there with 10,000 followers that Jesus was following along on. So he didn't expect any of this. So Nathanael hears this, and he says, how do you know about me? And then Jesus replies, and this seems so obscure. I could see you under the fig tree before Philip found you. Now, we have no idea what was going on when he was there under that fig tree. We don't know. Maybe he was praying. Maybe he was wrestling with some kind of crisis. Maybe he was wondering what to do with his life. Maybe he's asking God, if you're real, why is everything so hard? Was he just some kind of struggle with his faith? We don't know. All we know is that when Jesus says that to Nathanael, for Nathanael, that confirms that Jesus is the Messiah. In fact, Nathanael says, Rabbi, you are the Son of God, the King of Israel. That one little impact, that one little experience was all that Nathanael needed, and he goes from being a doubter to a believer. And we can be tempted to think that, well, is that what it always has to be like? Like when I was growing up, the kind of church I grew up in, there was like, that's how it always works for everybody. Boom, there's just 1 minute where it flips. 60 years later, I don't find that to be the case. That some people do experience that. I experienced that. But I know lots and lots of people who do not experience that. Some folks grow up in church, and initially you grow up, kind of your faith is given to you. But as you get older, you start to develop your own faith and you come to know Jesus. Right? Other times it's just you go through a period of, I think maybe not. As time goes on, you come to grow and know and have that relationship. And it turns out that even for the apostles, most of them did not have an experience like Nathanael's. Most of the apostles would need time to know Jesus and understand who he is. And even as the apostles began to become aware that Jesus might be the Messiah, or probably was the Messiah, or maybe even is the Messiah, even their expectations of what Messiah would mean was wrong, right? Their belief was that the promised Messiah was going to be like a general, like a military power. They were going to be like King David that was going to lead them into a military uprising to crush their opponents. And so even as they were believing that Jesus was the Messiah, they weren't really clear what he was here to do, or at least they had their own idea of what he should do. And so the thing that I want us to understand is that they're getting it wrong right from the start, as we often do. And I don't say that to be problematic. What I want to demonstrate is that they have one level of understanding, one level of belief, one level of faith that will evolve over time. In fact, according to the gospel author John, so the apostle John, initially when they start following Jesus, most of them didn't necessarily believe that he was the Messiah. They thought he was pretty interesting and he was something special. But John tells us that there was one event that caused the apostles to start believing in Jesus. And it's this thing called the wedding at Cana. And the wedding at Cana is famous for what? Water in the wine. The first miracle involves alcohol. What do we do with that? I'm going to let it go. Sorry. Anyway, first miracle involves alcohol. So basically, what John tells us is this. As Jesus turns the water into wine, John says, this miraculous sign at Cana in Galilee was the first time Jesus revealed his glory. And what happens? And his disciples believed in him. That means they've been following him for days. Didn't believe he was Messiah. They believed he was something special, but they didn't believe he was the Messiah. It was actually only after seeing that they start to believe he's the Messiah, although they still have the wrong picture of what the Messiah is going to do. And that's the thing I want us to see, is that even as they start to believe in him, they don't have a full understanding, right? They still need to grow. And I think the thing that John would tell us is that if we look at their lives, it's the importance of time to recognize, again, whether you've been a believer for decades or weeks, right? It's still a process of time, a process of growing, a process of understanding more deeply. And something that we want to really keep in mind, that much of my early Christianity, I looked at the Gospels, in other words, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I looked at those as if they'd been written in real time. Like almost there's somebody walking around following Jesus, writing everything down, kind of every time he says something. Like Jesus gets on the Sermon on the Mount going, who takes shorthand? This is going to be a long one, right? But that's not how it went, right? The Gospels weren't written until years later. Now, not centuries later, but years later. And so when the Gospels are written down, the folks writing it have the benefit of the years that they followed Jesus. They see Jesus' death and resurrection, interact with the resurrected Jesus, go out preaching their message for years. And then after all that, what we know as the gospel gets written down. We know that John was an old man. We think he may have been like in his 80s or 90s when he actually wrote it down. Don't be offended because I said 80 or 90 is an old man. Can we agree on that that's kind of old? Is that okay? All right. You know, other ones are written down sooner. But the thing is that we look at this and you see all these kind of points being made, but it was only after reflection and repeated experiences, interaction with Jesus. In fact, if we were sitting down with John, and as he talks about this idea of turning the water into wine, that basically what we can see is that when they first saw it, they thought of it as a miracle, right? That he must be the Messiah, that he's a miracle. It's a miracle because he can control nature, in effect. But John would tell us that only later did they realize it was more than a miracle. John tells us that it wasn't just a miracle, it was a miraculous sign. In other words, Jesus was pointing towards what he was here to do. He wasn't just showing off. He was making a point that his very first miracle, water into wine, was meant to point something out. That he was here to do something completely unexpected. That he was here to change the way we interact with God, to establish a new way to connect with God, to actually have a relationship with God based on faith. That Jesus had done the work to fulfill the Old Testament, to fulfill the Old Covenant, and he was now here pointing another way to God. And he demonstrates that through this miracle. And the question is, well, how does he demonstrate that? Like what was going on that means that particular miracle was pointing to this new covenant somehow? And John kind of walks us through it, though. If you kind of read through the first couple of chapters of John, that's chapter 2, he actually talks about this wedding. And the wedding's kind of interesting, right? Because, and we've talked about this before, that back in that kind of ancient time frame, weddings were often long events, sometimes lasting for days. And so there's this wedding, and it appears to be a fairly large wedding, and the apostles are all there, and Jesus is there, and Jesus' mom is there. And basically, as the wedding goes on, the wine's starting to run low. Right? And in culture, that would have actually been deeply embarrassing for the family, that they had not had enough resources for the wedding. And so if you know the story, you know that Mary kind of goes over to Jesus and says, hey, can you help him out a little bit? And so Jesus does this kind of odd thing, right? We know that he actually converts the water into wine. But the way it happens is so incredibly important. And it shows us so much about what Jesus was trying to demonstrate that these apostles would completely have missed until much later. So it actually goes like this. So as Mary asked Jesus to, hey, help him out, John tells us that standing nearby were 6 stone water jars used for Jewish ceremonial washing. Each could hold 20 to 30 gallons. And Jesus told the servants, fill the jars with water. Now you're like, okay, there's these big decorative jars off to the side, and Jesus says fill them with water. Like what's going on there? Well, these jars were a part of their religious practices. Right? That these were part of what was known as being ceremonially clean. That under the Old Covenant, the Old Testament structure, there was this process. In order to be clean before God or be considered clean before God, you had to go through this ceremonial washing. So these jars were normally filled with water, and you would go through a very specific process of washing. And now the water in the jars made you clean before God. In fact, the modern theologians look at this narrative and they say the thing that they want us to see is that those jars were the very symbol of the old covenant. That basically Jesus was taking the thing that represented that old relationship with God, and then he actually uses that and does what? He turns it into wine. So where's all this going? Right? He turns it into wine, and after he turns it into wine, he tells the servants, take the water, now wine, and take it over to the guy who's the host of the whole event. Excuse me, the coordinator of the whole event. And as the coordinator tastes the wine, he says, a host always serves the best wine first. Then when everyone has had a lot to drink, he brings out the less expensive wine. But you have kept the best until now. And what John would tell us is that, wow, when they saw it, they go, this is a miracle. He must be the Messiah. And we think he's going to do things a certain way. But he later realized that it was this thing that was a sign. And it would not be until after Jesus' death and resurrection that they finally understood this. Because what John would tell us is that we saw that miracle. We thought he was the Messiah. We thought he was going to do things the way we thought he would. But after we walked with him for years, and we sat down on that Thursday night before he would be executed, and we sat down to dinner with him, he said a bunch of specific things, and we still didn't get it. And then he dies on the cross, and then he's resurrected. And then we interact with the resurrected Jesus. And we thought about all those experiences. And then something occurred to us. Something that Jesus said during that Last Supper. Right? Remembering that at Cana, he took the Old Testament way of being clean before God and took that water that was used to be clean and turned it into wine. And then at the Last Supper, Jesus says this, or the narrative tells us this. After supper, Jesus took another cup of wine and said, this cup is the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you. So what Jesus is saying here is that you are now made clean before God through my blood. The wine that we share at this Last Supper, the wine that we share today as communion, is a symbol of Jesus' blood. And so that water that you used to need to be clean before God, that you used to have to repeat a process over and over again to be clean before God, Jesus is saying that I've done that now. I'm replacing all of that with one act. Through his death and resurrection, we are made clean before God. Jesus' very first miracle was intended to show his followers, to show us that his original purpose right from the beginning was to replace that old covenant and everything that went with it because God had something better now. A better covenant, a covenant of faith through the work of Jesus, through the blood of Jesus. And that's what we celebrate every time we have communion. That Jesus was doing something brand new. And the thing that I get to see through in all this is that the very people who were there with Jesus, people who followed him physically, spent years with him, did not understand all that Jesus was here to do in their lives, in our lives, until years and years later. Because they had spent so much time and considered so much that they finally understand. In fact, John actually admits that as Jesus had told them over and over again that he would die and be raised again from the dead, and John's like, we didn't get it. He actually records in John chapter 2. After Jesus was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered he had said these things, and they believed both the scriptures and what Jesus had said. In other words, what Jesus was doing in that time frame was so far beyond what they expected because they had their own preconceived ideas of what he was going to do that they completely missed it. But as they went through their lives, they developed a more complete picture. Right? And that's the thing that my prayer is for each of us, is that to not feel like we have to completely understand everything at one time. To not feel like there is a goal to try to completely understand everything. The goal is to recognize that it's a journey. That our journey of faith is called a journey of faith. Why? Because it's a journey. Right? That it's okay to be a work in progress. In fact, if you don't see yourself as a work in progress in your relationship with God, I'd ask you to look at that. Right? Because none of us ever really get there. Right? That all of us are on a journey. And the thing that I'm really hoping that we can be aware of is that if we think there is some predefined path that we are supposed to work, there is some preconceived moment where every person suddenly believes in Jesus, if we have this preconceived idea of how certain things are supposed to be done, we can really miss what God is doing. God is a big God, and he doesn't fit in little boxes. And the knowledge that God shares out to us is immense. And we're not meant to absorb it all at once. It is built in such a way that a little bit of understanding goes a long way. And a little bit more goes longer still. And it's to recognize that the goal is not just to memorize a bunch of things and prove how fast you can read the Bible or whatever it is. The goal is to look at what it means, apply it in our lives. Because the reason I think that the apostles could start to see these things and understand more deeply is, of course, they had this very direct physical relationship, in presence of Jesus. But also, they spent the rest of their lives living out what they had experienced, what they had seen, right? That our faith is a call to action, right? Increasing our knowledge strengthens us and it empowers us. But nothing gives us understanding like application, like using it, like living it out. And so my invitation to all of us, particularly this morning as we celebrate communion, is to recognize that God is trying to do something big in your life. He's doing something big through your life. But recognize that in order to see it, we've got to seek him. And it's ongoing. And to keep seeking him and to keep applying it and keep doing it. And as we do that, we begin to understand more deeply. Right? No matter where we are in our journey, no matter how old we are, that opportunity still sits in front of us because the message of Jesus has always best been shared personally. And when we actually live it out in our lives, experience it in our lives, and then share it with the people in our lives, that's when we grow closer and closer to God and more deeply see what God is trying to show us in our lives.